Do you know what's stopping you from doing that one thing you've always wanted to do? You don't, because it doesn't exist. This is Josh Bauer, and no, it really doesn't exist. Tax liens are a very interesting subject. I want to talk about them a little bit. So, what is the point in discussing tax liens? The strategy of using tax liens is a method of acquiring real estate for a fraction of what the real estate is actually worth. So why would you want to do this? First of all, what's real estate? Real estate is land. Land, which in many cases includes buildings, whether that be homes, apartment buildings, commercial, all that. Or it could just be land. Any of that's real estate. So why would you want to buy real estate for less than it's worth, other than just to brag, hey, I got a good deal on it? Well, there's a number of reasons that you would want to do that. Number one is if you want to turn around and resell it, you could obviously make a pretty large profit off of that. A second motivation for wanting to buy real estate at a cheap price would be if you want to buy a home, right? If you want to buy a home to live in, obviously rent is pretty expensive in quite a few areas, basically everywhere. And the idea of buying a home is that theoretically, A, you don't have to pay rent on a monthly basis, so that's an expense that you're not incurring anymore. And B, you actually own it. So, it's much less likely for it to get taken away from you. What's another reason that people might want to get into real estate? Well, a third option would be if somebody wants to become a landlord and rent out properties. So all three of these reasons are good reasons why somebody would want to buy real estate really at all. And then obviously anything that you want to buy, it's not a bad idea to try to get as low of a price on it as you possibly can. So let's say you're just a typical person that wants to buy a house. You are currently renting an apartment, and let's say a home in your area, I don't know, I live in upstate New York. Let's say a home is going to cost you $250,000. A typical down payment, I'd say, is somewhere between 10 and 20%, 10 and 30% somewhere. That's going to be like between 20 to 25,000 up to like $40,000 to $50,000 in a down payment. It's doable, depending on how much you make and how good you are at saving that money that you make. It might take you like 10 years. So just on a basis of time and saving time and of achieving the goal quicker of purchasing a home, the cheaper of a price you can buy the home for, obviously, the less time it will take you to save up for that down payment and to be able to afford that home. So if you want to move into a home quicker, it's going to benefit you to find a home at a cheaper price. Now, obviously, depending on like if you're just looking for price, if you go on Zillow and you're just sorting price low to high, well, you're probably going to get a bunch of garbage results on there, things that really need money put into them in order to get them to work. And unless you're into fixing up homes like that, that's most likely something that's going to be much more hassle than it's worth. So there's a lot of cases where you don't want to just buy the cheapest thing that's out there. But if you can buy a high value property at a low cost, then that's a different story from buying a low value property at a low cost. Basically, tax liens are liens that are levied against a property by the government, specifically county governments, and a lien is basically a document that says if you don't pay us back, then we get to take whatever asset this lien is on. So a lien can be on a car, lien can be on a house, and liens can be used mostly, they can be used by anyone, but they are used mostly by banks and tax agencies like the IRS and county tax authorities. Now, what does that have to do with you, right? Okay, so fine. Somebody didn't pay their property taxes, and the government's going to come in and put a lien on their home so that if they don't pay the county their property taxes, the county comes in and possesses, takes back, reclaims their house. Okay, cool. How does that have to do with you? And how is that a method of you getting cheaper property? Well, the answer to that is simply that the county doesn't like to hold all these liens. What does it mean to hold a lien? It basically means that the county is holding the outstanding debt. The property owner owes money to the county, and right now the county is just having to deal with that fact that they are not getting their money. And the county doesn't like that because, fire departments need training, they need firefighters, they need to pay salaries. Post office, well, that's a federal government thing, but there are a lot of county functions that need to properly run. And if 18%, I'm sure it's not that high, let's say maybe 4% of the county is not paying their property taxes. 4% is not that large, but it's a decent chunk of money that's not coming in. So what the county is going to do is they're going to try to offset that lack of revenue by temporarily fixing it. So how do they temporarily fix it? Well, they sell the lien. So let's say the property owner owes the county $5,000 in taxes, property taxes specifically. The county is going to say, okay, we're putting a lien on your property for $5,000. Now, if you don't pay us this $5,000 within 2 years, we're just going to take your property. But the county also doesn't want to sit on that debt for 2 years. It wants to get its $5,000. So what the county is going to do is it's going to put up for auction or for sale that lien on the property so that somebody else can come in. It doesn't have to be a family member. It doesn't have to be a resident of the county. It doesn't even, in most cases, have to be a resident of the United States. It can be any entity. It probably can't be a government, I would assume. But realistically, any person in the world that wants to come in and buy that lien from the county can do so. They come in, they pay the county $5,000, and they get a piece of paper called a certificate lien or whatever. I honestly forget what the official term for it is. They get a sheet of paper that says, okay, now I own the lien on this property. And they pay the government $5,000. So now the government has its money. The property owner is still technically living in their property, and this random person from the outside just came in and paid that county $5,000, and they now have a lien on that property. So if the property owner does not pay that $5,000 back to the county within whatever that redemption period is, maybe it's 2 years, then that third party that came in and bought the lien for $5,000 will get to foreclose on that property and take the property from the property owner. Now, it's not the third party who's taking the property from the property owner, because that would have happened either way, even if he hadn't bought the lien. If he hadn't bought the lien, it's not like the lien would have just disappeared or ceased to exist. The lien would still have been held by the county. So if somebody else hadn't bought the lien, then it's just the county that would have foreclosed on the property and taken the property. So either way, the property would have been reclaimed by the county, and the property owner would no longer have it. But the fact is, in this case, it is a third party that forecloses on the property if they buy the lien from the county. So when they do that, they foreclose on the property and it's now theirs. So let's say Roy owed $5,000 to, I don't know, Monroe County, New York, and Monroe County, New York said, we don't want this debt. Or it's not Monroe County's debt because they don't owe somebody else, but somebody else owes them. But they don't want to just, that doesn't help them that somebody owes them money. They have bills to pay. So they say, okay, we need liquid money coming in. We need cash flow, right? So they're going to have, let's say, Bob come in and pay Monroe County $5,000 so that Bob now owns the lien on Roy's property instead of the county owning the lien on Roy's property. So Bob forecloses on Roy. Roy no longer owns the home that he's in. He has to leave. And Bob now owns that home. Now, here's the thing. Bob owns the house. Period. How much did he pay for that? He paid $5,000 for a lien. Now, here's the thing. It usually doesn't work out like that. Why? Because chances are that the value of that property is probably at least $150,000 if it's not a great property. If it is a good property, upwards of $250,000. And Roy, unless he's a real idiot, is not going to let that entire thing go for $5,000. If he's really in such a hard situation, he would just sell the property. Sell it for cheap even, but don't let it go for nothing. Don't just let somebody take it from you. Sell it for, selling it for $35,000 would be better than just letting somebody foreclose on you. So there's no way that, I mean, it happens occasionally, if somebody dies and there's nobody to handle their estate, or if somebody is just so out of it, or I don't even know why someone do it. There's really no good excuse, in my opinion, but it does happen. Statistically, it's somewhere between like 3 and 5% of cases. It actually does go to foreclosure, but usually it doesn't. Usually Bob doesn't get to foreclose on Roy because Roy pays the property tax before the 2-year redemption period. Okay, fine. So some cases, Roy might get that property for, that $150,000 to $250,000 in value property for just $5,000, but it doesn't happen all the time like that. Okay, but that is the best case scenario, and that is really what is so attractive about tax liens, because there is a potential, albeit a small potential, there is a potential for you to just buy a piece of paper from a county government, and then within a certain amount of time, if you be patient, you might have the right, not only the privilege, but the right to take the property that you have a lien on, and now you own it. And if there was a mortgage on it beforehand, there's not a mortgage on it anymore. The county completely wipes that off. So you own just the positive value on that land, and you don't have a mortgage, you don't have any debt with it. So that's what's so attractive about tax liens. Now, the question is, okay, that's the best case scenario. What happens if Roy pays back his $5,000 property taxes? Well, it depends on, this is where it really, really depends on the state that you live in and on the state that you are buying tax liens in. Because that second one actually matters more. It doesn't really matter where you live. It matters where you're buying the tax liens, because there's 50 states, and just like with everything else, each state does things absolutely differently. But typically, you will be paid back your $5,000 that you spent on buying that lien. You will give up the lien, but you'll be paid back your $5,000 by the county, and you'll also be paid interest on that tax lien. Now you ask, okay, well, how much interest? And where is that interest coming from? And is that guaranteed? I mean, you put your money in a bank account and that has an interest rate, but it changes, seems like every other month. So how would you know this is guaranteed? So a couple things. Is it guaranteed? Yeah, it's guaranteed by state law. Okay, so in Florida, I believe the interest rate is set at 18%. And I feel like Illinois is at something crazy like 36%. I might be wrong about that. That might be Indiana. But there's a different percentage for each state. I think Texas is in the 20s, New York is in the 20s, like 22 or something. So it's a different percentage interest rate by each state that you're mandated to get back on your money. And then you ask, where does that come from? Well, it doesn't come from the county. The county is not paying you interest. It's actually the property owner that's paying you interest, which makes sense if you think about it, because if you refuse to pay your property taxes, I'm sure you can reasonably expect to be paying a lot of penalties on it, and it turns out that those penalties you pay just end up going to subsidize the person who bought that lien from the county. So the county's just saying, okay, we're collecting these extra fees from the property owner because they paid their taxes late. We're going to use that we're going to use those extra fees and turn that into interest, which will then incentivize third parties to come in and fund the operations of our county by giving us a little bit of cash flow. So that's where the interest comes from. Now, a lot of times the interest isn't really as good as you think it might be. And the reason for that is, so for example, in Florida, yeah, the interest rate is by default 18%. But it's an auction on a tax lien, so you have to say, okay, there's 50 people in a room, and there's a tax lien for sale. Typically, let's say the person owes, I don't know, $200 in taxes. In some states, they would say, okay, you want to buy this tax lien, you got to pay $200. Okay, going once, going twice. Okay, we got $210, $220. Well, that's not how it works in Florida. In Florida, you don't pay more for the tax lien itself. You bid down on the interest. So you have a $200 tax lien and say, okay, here's a $200 tax lien. That's the principal. That's it. That's what you're going to pay. But is there anybody here that's willing to accept, instead of 18%, 16%? Somebody raises their hand for 16%. Okay. What about 14%? Okay. Let's say it goes all the way down to 12%, then nobody else is willing to go lower. That means that 12% is what the interest is going to be on that, and you're only going to get 12% on your money for the first year. And there are caveats on like multiple years if the property owner doesn't pay taxes for multiple years, but that's getting a little more complicated. But the point here is that this whole process can go one of two ways. You buy a tax lien from the county because a property owner owes taxes to the county, and either the property owner pays back the county and you get interest on your money. That could be very high or very low depending on the state that you're in, and if anybody else bid down that interest. Either you get that interest back and the principal back, or they don't pay the county back and you get to foreclose on the property. Now, in my opinion, this kind of sounds like a no-brain investment, but the problem comes into theory versus reality. So I think this is a perfect time for me recording this podcast. And actually, the reason for the timing of me recording this episode specifically, not really the podcast, but this episode, is that I just got back from a tax auction. Now, in New York State, they sell mostly tax deeds, to the best of my awareness. So this is a little bit different than tax lien. So a lot of states sell the liens that we were just talking about. Some of those states don't even, mess with that debt stuff. They just say, okay, you owe us property taxes. You have 2 years paid off. If you don't pay it off, the county's just going to foreclose on your property, and we're going to take it from you, and then we're just going to resell it. And that's basically, to my understanding, how it is in Erie County, which is where I currently live, Buffalo. And they have in-person auctions here of tax foreclosed properties about every year. This year it was on September 25th, which was today. I took off work, actually, so I could go in. It started at like 9 o'clock, and I thought it was going to take like 2 hours. It ended up it was still going when I left. I was probably there for 5 or 6 hours, honestly. It was very interesting, but also it got boring very fast. But what I was talking about earlier, where there's a difference between theory and reality, because you think something might be a good deal, but you really have to do research on it because it might actually not be a good deal. There are plenty of cases where, you see an address of a property that somebody's not paying taxes on. You say, oh, okay, interesting. I know this location. I know this town. It's a nice town. Okay, they owe $5,000. I'm going to look up the street address. Holy shit, that is a nice house. You look at the house and you realize, wow, this has been sitting on this list for 2 years. Person hasn't paid property taxes. And then maybe you go to bid on that property, and then you realize it's literally a sliver of land, like not even 0.05 acres, just like a couple feet wide, and maybe stretches down, I don't know, alongside of two different properties, like bordering. It's like a split between two properties or something. There are maps that help you find this, but my point is that there are a lot of things where there is a potential to make mistakes. And there are a lot of quote-unquote deals that you can buy that actually turn out to be nightmares. And on the other hand, there are a lot of deals that you think, you get excited over, and then they get swept right out from underneath your feet. So, for example, I did a little research before this auction, and I had 7 properties specifically that, first of all, I wasn't going to bid on them because I didn't have enough money to bid on them at this point in time. But I printed out a sheet of paper for each of these properties, and I brought all these papers to the tax auction so that I could follow these properties and see what happened to them, and see how much they actually sold for, and see what the bidding process looked like on them and everything. And when I got there, the first 3 that I had noted, they weren't even on the list anymore. So what must have happened was the property owner must have redeemed them before it got to auction, which makes sense. And then the other 4, typically the bidding price in Erie County starts at how much they owe back taxes on. So one of them was like $700 or something, but $700 that they owed in property taxes. But the value of the land, this was just a plot of land up in like, it was on Millersport Highway, not quite up towards Lockport, but like right at the intersection of 78 and 263, just about in Buffalo. If anybody here is local listening to this, they kind of know where that is. Just a plot of land up there, and it was worth about $45,000. And typically the bidding price is going to start at that $700, but for some reason the bidding price just started at $45,000, and so nobody even bid on it. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, no wonder that's been sitting there for 2 years. It's probably what they've done the last 2 years. Nobody's going to buy a plot of land for the exact amount that it's worth, most likely. I mean, if they want to do that, then, they can just use a real estate agent. They don't have to, sign up and wait in line for an hour at a tax auction that only happens once a year and then sit there for 4 hours and wait for the serial number to get called. That's crazy. They would just go to some real estate agent and buy it, much quicker process than that if they're going to buy it for full value. So my point is, a lot of these quote-unquote good deals, like the actual good deals that aren't really garbage, a lot of these good deals, either other people will beat you to them, or it turns out they are too good to be true. So my only conclusion to this is there is a lot of potential, but there's also a lot of competition. And I'm not sure that you have to make it a full-time job if you want to have any sort of success. But I certainly think that it's not as easy as I initially anticipated it would be. And so for that reason, I'm not discouraging anyone to do it, from doing it, but I am saying that you need to have a mind that is geared towards being very analytical and searching through a lot of numbers. And I'm sure AI is going to change this. So if you know how to use AI effectively and efficiently in order to take long tasks and make them a lot shorter, then that's good. And I also happen to have a couple of part-time employees, which also I kind of intend to use on this at some point. But I'm just personally at the point in the process where I'm learning how to even do this myself. So I can't teach them how to do it if I don't even know how to do it. When it comes to vetting properties and doing due diligence on them and everything, I have to figure out how to do that myself before I try to outsource it and make it more efficient. But my whole point here is, if you're not willing to do this whole process and put a lot of effort into it and a lot of energy into it and print out these pages and, go to the properties and look at them, don't go on them because it's trespassing in a lot of cases. Usually people still live there, but actually drive to all these properties and make sure that the Google Maps image isn't 4 years old and there's actually not a house there anymore because it got tore down or burnt down or something, and that's why it's selling for so cheap. You have to actually put in a decent amount of work in order to make sure that A, you're not getting ripped off, and B, you have a good shot at some of these properties that actually are good deals. But my conclusion is that you have to put in the time to really figure out what you're doing and to really vet these properties. And I've only been into this for a week, so I'm not by any means an expert on any of this, except that there have been a couple of days where I put a lot of time into researching exactly what this is. I spent an entire day on this. I mean, probably 8-9 hours in that one day. So don't get me wrong, I've put time into this, but I'm not anything near an expert. But what I am doing here is I'm just sharing my own experiences as I go along. And I've already talked to some of my friends about this business model because I find it so intriguing, and I can't believe that I haven't discovered it sooner. I really do think there's a lot of potential here, and I'm definitely going to be putting a lot of my effort into trying to make this work. And I've talked to a lot of people about this, and that's why I'm doing this podcast, is because I think it's a very interesting topic. But I think that I rushed into it very hastily and quickly realized that it's not a get-rich-quick scheme, because you really have to put in the work, just like anything else, and you have to put in a lot of research. You have to show up to some auctions, and if you want to do online auctions, which there are plenty of, that's okay, but be prepared to most likely not buy anything for 2 years unless you're willing to bid almost as much as the value of the property is. And we're talking about tax deeds right now, not tax liens. I haven't even bought a tax lien yet, so I don't know how the auction process is with that. But I know that I just went to a Buffalo auction just now, and that room was packed. And none of those, in my opinion, in my experience, none of those properties, the good ones, actually sold for super cheap. They all were bid up. So if you want to do this, as far as the tax deeds are concerned, I think there's a shot. You just gotta put a lot of time into it and a lot of work into it. And if you want to do the tax liens, well, I think that theoretically that will work pretty well, although I haven't done it yet. Like I said, the reason I'm doing this show is I want to share my experiences as I'm going along. And my experience so far has just been, I jumped in very, very quickly and found out that there's a lot more work involved than some people advertise it to be. And I certainly have confirmed that there's a high potential here, but it's going to require a lot of work. Now let me deviate a little bit and talk about something that I just kind of mentioned right towards the end there, which is that some people advertise this to be a get-rich-quick scheme and also something that is going to really turn you into a landlord basically immediately. And even with tax liens, I just don't see that happening. I think that over 10 years, if you are going hard on this as your real estate strategy, dude, counties are not going to change. Like, come on, there's how many counties in the United States? I don't even know. But each one of these tax lien auctions and everything, it's one per county. It's not one per state. Even if it was one per state, that would be pretty good news because there's 50 different states. But we're talking how many counties in each? Dude, there's probably 100 counties in each state? Maybe that's too many. I don't think it's too liberal to say there's probably around 5,000 counties in the United States. Obviously, there's less in Rhode Island and probably more in California, but I don't know. There's a lot of counties. So my point is the chances that all these government agencies, which are known for being very inefficient and behind the times, the chances that they're going to all just stop doing this, it doesn't make sense. I mean, the process exists in almost every county because it makes sense. It's a way for them to get this funding and incentivize property owners to pay their property taxes. So this process isn't going anywhere. It's not going, it's not like, oh my gosh, cryptocurrency, I wonder if it's still going to be here in 10 years. Like, it probably will. But with this, like, I don't think you even have to ask with this. This is just such, in my opinion, it's a very long-lasting investment strategy. It's something that you don't really have to worry about. Property isn't going anywhere. As the last time I checked, the right to own property in the United States as an American is not going to go anywhere. And counties are not going to go anywhere. And counties need to fund schools and roads and water, sewers and fire departments and police departments, although, that's not going to go anywhere. So this, in my opinion, is a very good long-term investment strategy, just on the basis that you don't have to worry about the system collapsing on itself. And even if a county says, okay, we're not doing this anymore, well, find another county that's still going to do it. A lot of them do. So it's very easy for you to use this in a 10-year plus investment strategy. I think that if you use tax liens and tax deeds over a period of 10 years, I don't see how you're not a millionaire if you do it correctly. Alright guys, so this is going to wrap up my episode on tax liens. I am really just giving you an anecdote on my experience. I'm not professing to be an expert in this by any means. I've just been really researching this for the past couple weeks, which is not really long enough to say whether or not it has worked for me over the long term. So that said, I'm keeping everyone updated as I go along. I don't know when the next episode on Tax Liens 2.0 will be. I do know for sure that I will definitely continue working with this and investing in some tax liens in the states where you can invest in tax liens. I believe Nebraska and Iowa are some of the ones that I'm definitely considering. They have little bit higher interest rates. I think a little bit lower competition in my opinion. And then tax deeds, Washington State, King County, Seattle. I'm looking at that. I'm looking at Erie County, obviously, for tax deeds, but they only have the auction once a year. Most of them do once a year. So you have to time it correctly. And it's one of those things where I might not have a good update on this topic for another year and a half, 2 years, maybe after I've already invested in a couple liens or maybe even bought a couple properties at auction. But it's certainly not something I'm going to have another update on next week, because this is just something that, even for the auctions, you have to wait an entire year before you go to the next auction in the same county. So it's just not something that transpires quickly and that you can get an update on very quickly. But I'm definitely going to have some episodes on this in the future regarding how I'm progressing. And anybody that's interested, definitely follow this podcast. I think it's very possible that I will discuss other investment strategies that I come across in the future. Maybe I'll actually dive into some ones that are complete BS, which I have certainly come across as well, just as kind of a warning to stay away from them. So if that is something that interests you at all, another good reason to follow this podcast. I definitely am into personal finances quite a bit and investing. I'm not really a fanatic when it comes to the more weird stuff like cryptocurrency and NFTs and all that. Like, I follow it to some degree, but I'm definitely not super into it. I do keep tabs on it just to make sure, I'm not getting left behind or anything. But at the same time, I tend to gravitate more towards the long-term, tried and tested forms of investing like real estate and businesses, which is another word for investing in the stock market. When you invest in the stock market, you're just getting equity in actual real businesses. So these are some things you'll continue hearing me talk about if you stick around and keep listening to the podcast. Of course, you're going to hear me talk about a bunch of other random things too that has nothing to do with finances or investing, but that's the excitement of listening to the next episode, which I don't even know what it's going to be about. That said, you'll be hearing from me maybe 2 weeks from now. Bye.